Right now, on your wrist or in your pocket, there is a machine. A tiny, ticking machine that humans have been perfecting for over 500 years. Kings have worn it as jewelry. Soldiers have worn it to survive a war. And somewhere along the way, it quietly changed how the entire human race thinks about time itself. This is the story of the watch, and trust me, it's a lot stranger than you think. Before there was a watch, there was just the sun. For most of human history, if you wanted to know the time, you looked up. Ancient Egyptians used sundials as early as 1250 BC. When the sun went down, people switched to water clocks, sand clocks, even candles marked with lines to measure the hours as they burned. In China, some of these candle clocks go back more than 1,500 years, but all of these had one massive flaw: you couldn't carry them around. A sundial doesn't fit in your pocket. A water clock doesn't survive a horse ride. For centuries, telling time was something you did in one place, not something you carried with you. That was about to change, and the reason it changed comes down to one small, coiled piece of metal. In the early 1400s, someone invented the mainspring, a tightly wound strip of metal that stores energy and slowly releases it as it unwinds. This single invention is the reason portable timekeeping became possible at all. Suddenly, you didn't need weights hanging off a tower clock to keep the gears turning. You could wind up a spring instead. By the late 1400s, the first small portable clocks started appearing in Europe. And then, in the German city of Nuremberg, a locksmith named Peter Henlein took things further. Around 1505, Henlein began crafting tiny clock watches, miniature drum-shaped timepieces small enough to wear as a pendant around the neck. People at the time were genuinely stunned. One writer described watching Henlein build these many-wheeled clocks out of small bits of iron, running for 40 hours without a single weight. Here's the twist, though: these early watches were absolutely terrible at telling time. They only had an hour hand. No minute hand existed yet, and they could lose several hours a day. Nobody cared, because that wasn't really the point. These watches weren't tools, they were status symbols. If you owned one, it meant you were rich, powerful, or connected to royalty. They were shaped like eggs, books, flowers, even skulls, and dripped in gold and jewels. Telling accurate time was, frankly, optional. For the next 150 years, watchmakers wrestled with one enormous problem. The mainspring doesn't release energy evenly. When it's fully wound, it pushes hard. As it runs down, it weakens. And that meant watches would run fast, then slowly drift, losing time all day long. Clever inventors tried to fix this with devices like the fusee, a cone-shaped pulley that balanced out the spring's changing force. It worked reasonably well and stayed in watches for almost 400 years. But the real breakthrough came in 1657, when the balance spring was added to the balance wheel, a small coiled spring that made the wheel oscillate at a far steadier rate. This one addition is credited to both Christian Huygens and Robert Hooke, and the two men spent years arguing over who actually invented it first. Regardless of who deserves the credit, the impact was massive. Watches that once lost hours a day suddenly lost only minutes. It was the moment the watch stopped being just a decorative trinket and started becoming an actual instrument. By the mid-1600s, fashion was shifting. Men started wearing waistcoats, and those waistcoats had pockets, the perfect place to slide a watch. Pendant watches slowly gave way to pocket watches, and for the next 2 centuries, the pocket watch would be the dominant way men carried time with them. It became such a standard accessory that even the small extra pocket on a pair of jeans today exists, because once upon a time, that's exactly where men kept their pocket watch. Meanwhile, watchmaking itself was becoming an industry. Switzerland's watch tradition actually began because of a religious ban. Swiss jewelers, forbidden from making decorative jewelry, turned their skills toward clockmaking instead. That accidental shift is part of the reason Swiss-made became a mark of quality that still means something today. And there's one story from this era that deserves its own movie. In the 1700s, sailors had a massive problem. They could measure latitude just fine, but longitude, how far east or west they'd traveled, was nearly impossible to calculate without an accurate clock. Ships were sinking, crews were getting lost, and the British government offered a fortune to anyone who could solve it. A self-taught carpenter named John Harrison spent decades of his life obsessively building a series of marine timekeepers. His fourth attempt, the H4, finally cracked it in 1761, a watch so precise it only drifted by a matter of seconds on a voyage across the Atlantic. Harrison essentially solved a problem that had stumped the greatest scientific minds of his generation, using nothing but gears and stubbornness. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone. The wristwatch existed long before it was considered acceptable for men to wear. The first known wristwatch is often credited to the legendary watchmaker Abraham Louis Breguet, who created one for the Queen of Naples around 1810 to 1812. For the next 100 years, wristwatches were seen almost exclusively as women's jewelry. Real men, the thinking went, carried a proper pocket watch. Wearing a watch on your wrist was considered, and this is a real quote from the era, a silly-ass fad. Then came the First World War, and everything changed. Soldiers in the trenches needed to check the time instantly, often in pitch darkness, often while holding a rifle in both hands. Fumbling for a pocket watch could get you killed, so officers began strapping their pocket watches to their wrists with leather cups, creating crude trench watches. Watchmakers quickly caught on and started manufacturing wristwatches specifically designed for combat. By the time the war ended, the wristwatch had gone from feminine novelty to battlefield necessity, and the stigma vanished almost overnight. Companies like Cartier had already been experimenting too. In 1904, Louis Cartier designed a wristwatch for his friend, the pioneering aviator Alberto Santos Dumont, because a pilot obviously can't dig through his pocket while flying a plane. Once the wristwatch was accepted, the industry became obsessed with making it more reliable. In 1926, Rolex patented the first waterproof and dustproof case, called the Oyster, and famously proved it by strapping one to a swimmer crossing the English Channel. In the 1920s, British watchmaker John Harwood invented the first self-winding or automatic wristwatch, using the natural motion of your arm to keep the mainspring wound, no more remembering to wind your watch every morning. By the mid-20th century, watches weren't just tools anymore, they were cultural statements. In the 1960s, as the world grew more prosperous, watches got bigger, bolder, and more expressive of personal identity. And then, in 1969, came the earthquake that shook the entire industry, the quartz watch. Quartz watches used a tiny, vibrating crystal instead of a mechanical balance wheel, powered by a battery instead of a hand-wound spring. The result was staggering accuracy for a fraction of the cost. Suddenly, a cheap quartz watch could keep better time than a handcrafted Swiss mechanical watch that cost 100 times more. Through the 1970s and 80s, this triggered what the industry now grimly calls the quartz crisis. Countless historic Swiss watchmakers, some centuries old, simply couldn't compete and shut down. It's estimated that tens of thousands of jobs in Swiss watchmaking vanished during this period. The mechanical watch, which had ruled for over 400 years, was suddenly fighting for its survival. But here's the beautiful twist in the story. Mechanical watches didn't die. Instead, the Swiss industry reinvented itself. Brands leaned hard into heritage, craftsmanship, and exclusivity, transforming the mechanical watch from a mere timekeeping tool into a luxury art object and even an investment. Today, ironically, a hand-wound mechanical watch that's technically less accurate than the cheapest quartz watch can sell for more than a house. So the next time you glance down at your wrist, remember what's actually sitting there. 500 years of obsession. A locksmith in Nuremberg chasing miniaturization. 2 rival scientists fighting over a spring. A carpenter who outthought the finest minds of the Royal Navy. Soldiers strapping watches to their wrists in the mud of the First World War. and an entire ancient craft nearly wiped out overnight by a tiny crystal. The watch was never really about knowing what time it is. It was about humanity's stubborn desire to hold time itself in the palm of our hand. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe, because this is just the beginning of the stories we're going to tell. Please like my channel, thank you.